coming from is formulated and directs based off of the experiences that we've had. Luckily, being born in South Florida, I've had the pleasure of being born and raised in a very diverse community with Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubanos, Haitians, Americans, all kinds. But I do understand that not everyone has had that experience. And being able to have these conversations to say, hey, you know, when you said X, you may want to kind of reshape it because this particular community, you know, may be offended by that based off of the historical context of the nation. So being able to have that and have a safe, psychologically safe space where people can come and raise their concerns without necessarily making them feel othered, making them feel denigrated, making them feel dismissed, right? And kind of articulating why it is so important for us to have these conversations. And I was just sitting in my car and was curious, and I just Googled hate crimes. And unfortunately, just being able to scroll through the various articles of hate crimes that have occurred just in this year, and we're just in the middle of March, right? So being cognizant of, you know, how that's impacting our communities, our families, our organizations, because it does take a toll, both mentally, emotionally, physically on individuals. So how do we kind of identify these inequities in the services that we provide, particularly from my perspective in Department of Fish and Wildlife, right? Where green spaces have intentionally, deliberately left out communities of color, right? So how do we catch up? How do we pause, take a look at ourselves and say, how do we rectify these inequities within the services that we provide, knowing that people of color have been left out, that people from the LGBTQ plus community have been left out. When we had this Pride logo for Department of Fish and Wildlife, we had a lot of great responses to the Pride logo. But as you can imagine, we had a lot of negative responses as well. And one of the comments that were made on our one of our social media platforms was like, well, nobody says gay people can't go outside. And I'm like, well, there's a difference with going outside and being welcome outside, right? There's a big difference in that. And for those that haven't experienced those symptoms, that feeling of not being wanted, of not being safe, you know, we all come from certain levels of privilege, and being able to acknowledge that privilege and not saying, hey, privilege is a bad word, right? Where I have certain privileges of being a cisgender, heterosexual, Latino male, and a veteran, and a US born citizen, have certain privileges that are afforded to me that others don't have. How do I recognize those privileges, and how do I help those that are coming behind me kind of uplift and participate in things that I have had the honor and pleasure and privilege of participating in, right? So I think it's a great start. It's going to be uncomfortable, right? And sometimes we have to get uncomfortable, or we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And it's not that we don't stop having the conversation. Bring an additional perspective that we may not see because it's the waters that we swim in. And until we get into another body of water, we realize it's too hot or too cold. But we don't acknowledge it when we're swimming in our own waters. So definitely looking forward to having the conversation. Again, I truly appreciate everyone online and everyone being here today. It's an absolute pleasure. And my watch is telling me it's time for me to go. So I will hand it back over to you, Lynn. Again, thank you so much. And yes, let's continue the conversation.
So the next speaker, who is going to be on Zoom, and I'm so grateful that she decided to join us today to share about her journey of her work, mobilizing and equip herself to deal with race and a lot of other issues. So here is Minna.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm again joining from California, and I'm a bit sick right now, so I sound a little crazy, but it's okay. Yeah, allow me to just share my screen. Yeah, so I guess for this conversation today, what I want to mention would be, I guess I'll just start off with the story of AAPI Youth Rising. We've formed when we organized a rally back in March of 2021. At the time, I was in seventh grade when I started organizing, and the rally's mission was to raise awareness around the rise in xenophobia and hate crimes targeting the Asian American community. And coming from the Bay Area in California, there is a very strong AAPI presence over here. And also because of that, there were a lot of hate crimes and violent actions committed against my community during the time at the beginning of the pandemic and over the past few years. So we really wanted to come together and take some sort of action for that. So we decided to do that. And that's where AAPI Youth Rising formed. And our mission is to advocate for issues facing our community, facing like the Asian American youth community and viewpoint. And I think the main mission of the group was just to raise awareness about some of these issues, like around AAPI youth mental health. And one of the big parts of our group has also been to target and advocate for Asian American history to be taught in classrooms. Even in like the really diverse area that I'm lucky to live in the Bay Area, I only ever really learned about the Japanese internment camps all through my middle school and elementary school experience. And even when we like learned about the gold rush or all of these key parts in American history that definitely involved Asian Americans, they were just excluded from that. And I didn't realize that they were excluded from that. I just thought that that's how it was, and Asians just weren't really a part of American history, even though we have played a very crucial role in like the development of, I don't know, all this stuff. And especially in California too, like when we focused on our California history unit, we really didn't hear a lot about Asian Americans at all. So we thought that that was a problem. So we've been volunteering to teach the one day of AAPI history lesson, which is on the screen right now. And our idea with this lesson was that we would volunteer to teach it and go into classrooms to teach the lesson and expose these students to some of these events in Asian American history. So I don't know. I thought that I could just go through a few of these slides and show you like what we tried to cover in the presentation. I don't want to do the whole thing because it's supposed to be like 30 minutes. And also yesterday I presented to my old middle school. So a little tired of reading it. So yeah, I'll just sort of go over some of the stuff that we were thinking of. Yeah, so let me see. So first, we try to introduce the class or whichever group of students that we're talking to. We try to introduce the idea of xenophobia and like the statistics behind it, and try to ask them if they know the terminology behind it, and then like explain to them what that is. And then we like address how xenophobia is not a new thing, and how many like Muslims and Sikhs and South Asians face xenophobia after 9/11 and all that. So yeah, then we just talk more about, I guess, sort of some myths facing the Asian American community, and that's where we start to introduce the perpetual foreigner myth, which is the idea that Asian Americans will never truly be a part of American culture and will always be a foreign entity, which is not true at all, because we've been here a very long time and contributed a lot. But we introduced that myth, and then go into like how that myth plays into the Chinese Exclusion Act and how it goes into like Indian immigration, and how I don't know, we talk about annexation of Hawaii, and also how the perpetual foreigner myth plays into the Japanese internment camps as well. That's another big focus of our lesson. We talk about the murder of Vincent Chin, AAPI civil rights movement, and a bit more of like how the Asian community came together and united under the term of Asian American, because it wasn't always like that. But yeah. Then we introduced the model minority myth, and try to explain how this is actually a very harmful myth, and also how like income disparity between different Asian American communities and different like specific ethnicities can be very different, and how if you don't like disaggregate the data, it looks very like cohesive and all together, but in reality there are a lot of different struggles between the different AAPI communities, and also how a lot of Asian American youth actually live in or near the poverty line in New York City, and you know, stuff like that. So we try to disprove the model minority myth and talk about how harmful it can be, and introduce that, I guess. And then a big part of this lesson is also introducing a lot of AAPI heroes. Because a lot of us, when we were kids, like I don't remember seeing many AAPI heroes ever. I don't remember seeing many Asian celebrities either. I mean, I had like, I don't know, we had like Crazy Rich Asians. I don't really know, but that was about it. There's very limited media representation for us that we saw growing up. I know there's been a recent shift towards focusing more on Asian media in the past few years, but we realized that a lot of people didn't know about these AAPI heroes, and they also didn't know about AAPI like historical heroes or figures who had done things. So we wanted to highlight some of that. We go into these people. We talk about some modern day AAPI heroes as well. And then we sort of go through like a few slides to end on more of a hopeful note of how, I don't know, about Asians just doing really cool things to their communities. We go through some like, I don't know, historical and present day heroes. And then, yeah, that's sort of the end of the lesson. We talk more about the importance of AAPI heroes, or sorry, AAPI history, and sort of end with like a what can you do slide for the students that we're teaching to. Yeah. So that's a bit about how we've been trying to combat the issue. We think that if Asians can be seen in these types in like the classroom setting and in a historical setting, that it can really turn the tides of the perpetual foreigner myth, and it can introduce the idea that Asians have actually contributed a whole lot. And if they can know about the different ways that Asians have been involved in, I don't know, like policy formation in the United States, we think that it would be really important to directly addressing these roots of bias towards the API community. Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, what else? What else is there to mention? Yeah, API. Oh, yeah, API Youth Rising is also run by all high school and middle school students. I'm currently a sophomore, and got a lot of math homework to do after this, so I gotta get on that at some point. But anyways, it was great talking to you all, and I'm excited to hear the rest of the speakers. So thank you.
My name is Kathy Barros-Freed, and first I had left a list of 3 books that maybe will be included in the notes. Our Hidden Conversations, Caste, and Our Migrant Souls. And I really hope we can expand the conversations in a small group to think about caste, not just race. Because without going to the caste, you don't pick up all the gender issues, and disability issues, religious issues that don't fit under the category of race. So that's why I brought that along, because that's a good reminder. And also, because those who know me I go off to tell stories, a little stream of consciousness, and I wander a bit. So my crutch is to have my outlines as I pay attention, keep on track, these people that want to hear you for the next hour. But I love telling stories, and I love getting involved with people face to face, so I'm glad to have persons here. Kathy Barros-Freed, and Barros is a Hispanic name. R between 2 vowels is a D, so if you think about saying it, think of it as D, Barros. And I thought about what perspective I bring, this wonderful panelists that you've got, and I appreciate that it's multi-generational as well. So I figured that's my role on the panel. I'm the elder, and so I'm authorized to tell stories, which I will do a bit of. And also the length of time I had in state government, I think, was hoping we'd talk a little bit about how one presumes effectiveness navigating state institutions, because bureaucracies can be deadening. And I spent 30 years in state government. Those of you who are state government people will know I was a PERS 1. So I bailed when I was 30 years in and 55. So I've been retired since 2000, oh my gosh. And over 8 state agencies. So I hopped a lot. I've got to be known as someone who was very effective kind of horizontally to move in. And for a long time, I presumed that was a negative thing. And so I thought, okay, well, what am I going to say about that kind of experience in state government? Because there's a lot that you bring with you when you have involvements that call upon influence and power and effectiveness. So why do we want to be powerful? Why do we want to have power? Why do we want to be effective? I mean, on a big scale, it's like we want to protect our family, we want to protect ourselves, we want to protect democracy. But also at a more personal level, we want to be effective in change. We want to be able to have an impact and to make something better because you are there. And that's the theme you'll hear from me, is to make something better because you are there. That's your assignment. And it's that last point that takes me to my ancestors. That's where power begins. Embrace who you are with those ancestors. Everything good, bad, quirky, and even if you don't know anything about your ancestors, they're all there with you. They're in your spine, or in your head, they're in your veins, and they provide that foundation, emotional and psychically, whether you think about it or not. And you can't squander what those generations, what those ancestors have done to get you where you are. So in 1990, I was appointed by Governor Mike Lowry to be director of the State Human Rights Commission. And at that point, I started interjecting my maiden name. It was Kathy Freed through the rest of the years. But when I became director of the State Commission, I injected Barros, Kathy Barros Freed. I didn't think I'd choked up about that. But I did that because that was a way to honor my grandmother, my ancestors. Have that Latino name, God damn it, on the executive list. But I was there. They were there with me. So I did that in a way that only meant something to me. Most people probably wonder, why did you do that? And it was a way to honor my ancestors. So I am the granddaughter of Jesucita Flemate Barros Torres. And Flemate, you've got to go back and you know what was happening in that history. So that's my grandmother. She crossed illegally, soltera, from Mexico with 2 children under the age of 5. And she was brave and fearless and underestimated through my high school years and my adulthood because she looked like a poor Mexican woman. She was underestimated all the time. And people were rude to her, and yeah. So to admire what she did, coming soltera with just 2 kids, crossed the border, went to Albuquerque, worked in a laundromat, moved then to the streets of Denver, then to the small farming community of Fort Lupton, Colorado, which is where she lived and where she grew up. And in Colorado, she was a homeowner. She established 2 small apartments in the back of the property next to the huge chicken house, where she helped illegals get oriented to the system and to where things are and where the church is and where it's safe and that kind of stuff. She did that very quietly. I'm the daughter of Jesse J. Barros, and the J is Jesus. He knew going through the system that being called Jesus was not exactly an attractive thing to do. It would bring all kinds of negative attention. So he went by Jesse J. Barros. And he just gave me so much of my, the 2 of them, particularly my fire, because he would tell stories, one of which I'll share with you, that as a 16-year-old, when he was part of a large farm work crew, they had worked a number of acres over weeks to hoe and weed and prepare the field. And when it came time to pay the crew, the farmer tried to cheat them, saying, you completed X number of acres. My dad knew that those number of acres was not accurate. That's not possible. But the farmer figured, they're not going to know about the acres. Well, he knew that in order to pay taxes, you had to go report how many acres you had in order to know what the government was going to be taxing you. So he went to the courthouse and he got the information about the number of acres, and he went back to the farmer and said, this is the paper that shows how many acres this is. And we did those acres. Was money. And he understood things like couldn't lean against the property. How a 16-year-old Mexican kid knew about those things, he couldn't even tell me, but he just knew it. So that underscores that knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. So he continued in his activism, and his entire life, he was very active in migrant housing, migrant health, education, labor unions, strong labor union guy. Was part of a strike against Cudahy Meatpacking Company, the first strike ever happened in the country. So he took no prisoners. He just took no shit from anybody. And that attitude, you just can't walk away from that. You can't not have that fire in you when you grew up with that. My mom, Elena Basser Barros, was the eldest daughter in a family of 15. You women in a large family, where does the burden lie? On the girls, yeah. And so in that environment, she didn't have the energy to be an activist, but she told me about and modeled, be clear about what your responsibilities are, and mostly be someone that other people can count on. You've got to be there for people. So I'm built on strong stuff, and I owe it to them to make something better because I was there. So the second aspect of assessing power is read the room. What are the dynamics? What's obvious? What's not so obvious? What's hierarchical? That's the obvious stuff. But the informal dynamics, the informal power structures, the little conversations that happened in the hallway before you got in there. After the meeting, who makes a beeline to different people in order to lobby and to do the kinds of things it is to have influence, because that's what power is having influence. And to be strategic about your own volume. That was another lesson I learned from my father, who could be a little strident and could be a little loud. And he became a member of the school board, the first Latino to be on the school board of this little Colorado town. And there was stuff he was advocating, and he knew his voice and his persona wouldn't be the one to be heard. So he worked with someone else on the school board whose style is more amenable to the other white members, and had that person bring forward this idea. And then it moved along. So he figured out what needs to be done and how does it need to be done, and not thinking you could necessarily demand or pound the table or accomplish things just because you got louder than everybody else. So adjust and assess what needs to be done, and see the gaps. What's being debated is what is on the table, the real issue, or are there other things underneath it? I do a lot of conflict resolution, dispute resolution center, did a bunch of training for military folks a number of years ago, and I'm really involved with that. So leadership is important, and people talk about leadership. But I think the stronger position is to be a bridge builder. And I hope that's how people think of me, as a bridge builder. So my 3 earlier reflections about how we're strengthened by our ancestors and our power comes from that knowledge, tuning into the values and perspectives of others and incorporating that. And the personal power is exponentially enhanced and increased. So thinking about bridge building, our Hidden Conversations is one of the books that I'm suggesting. And Michelle Norris has gathered information and talks about learning what people really think about race. And in that discussion, she goes on to say, people are talking about finding common ground. And it's not to put down common ground, that we should still seek that, but that it's not very realistic. And because we know that Americans don't agree on a whole lot of stuff. There's so much polarization on everything. What books should be read, what the schools should teach. What terms should be used, the politics, the whole thing, everything is polarized. There's hardly anything that's not polarized. So it can feel hopeless. But her thought is, and I really underscore it because I consider myself a bridge builder. So the closing thought is, her quote, "I applaud those who continue to bring people together to search for common ground. But I suggest we put more energy toward cultivating a generation of bridge builders who can help folks reach across differences toward better understanding and some framework for productivity, while Americans remain antagonistic in their ideological silos. We should lean toward this concept of bridge building. We should lean toward this concept of bridge building because people rarely cross a bridge in one direction. I think that visual is awesome. You travel across a bridge to go to a different place. And then generally, you come back. So you're coming back to your home base, more informed, and maybe even in some way enriched by your experience in this whole other realm. And I think that's a beautiful image when you think about crossing the bridge. So this is all about changing the dynamics of and for power. And it's just how we get there.
We are going to have Mukti next, who is going to share with us about how we can build ourselves up too and keep ourselves feel safe and healthy in order for us to be able to continue the work and then play that bridge builder that Cassie was talking about. So without further ado, here is Mukti. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. It is my deepest honor to be joining this very esteemed group. I understand this is your 5th annual race dialogue, and a real deep bow of gratitude and appreciation to Lynn and all the core group of the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition who have been doing and continue to do, holding the center in the South Puget Sound and connecting us regionally, nationally, and globally. So I hope my sharing can be a catalyst for a deeper dialogue and conversation. Where are we today? Today is day 46 of the Season for Nonviolence, and the Season for Nonviolence is a national and global observance of the potential for nonviolence to be transformative. It was started by some visionaries and dreamers to honor the death anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, which was January 30th, and the death anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King, April 4th, which both of them sadly died by at the hand of assassins. And this season speaks really deeply to me because as I honor my ancestors and my history, my parents were in Delhi in India post-partition of Pakistan and India, and were there during the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. And then as immigrants, refugees, we were the first East Indian family in Memphis, and we were there during the assassination of Dr. King when I was 7 during that time. So to take these days to deepen in our own theory and practice of nonviolence, this is an observation being done by a community in Virginia Beach, but it is something that we can all tap into, that no matter what is going wrong, we can be that change within how we respond to ourselves, our communities, our families, and our own thoughts. So the thought for today is compassion, that we live in a time when science is validating what humans have known throughout the ages, that compassion is not a luxury, it is a necessity for our well-being, resilience, and survival, Roshi Joan Halifax. And having compassion for ourselves, compassion and deep gratitude to all of you for showing up today on this beautiful Saturday morning. We also note it is the 21st death anniversary of our own Rachel Corey of the South Sound, and that many people are honoring, remembering that in our own community as the eyes of the world are on Rafa, where she lost her life 21 years ago today. So at this day also, it's very sad to hear of the death of any colleague, but particularly a colleague in education, as Lynn mentioned. And even the U.S. Department of Education mentioned on Thursday that educational institutions have a legal responsibility to create that discrimination-free environment. And yet at this moment, there is a nationwide rise in complaints, as some of my esteemed colleague speakers have said, against Muslims, Arabs, Sikhs, South Asian, Hindus, Palestinian students. And that's just what's known. There's probably even more that's unknown. So this transformative dialogue is very important. And I just want to expand the paradigm and possibility and plant some seeds and offer this group. I chatted with Lynn a little bit yesterday, and I've come to see this is a very leaderful group. And so I don't want to spend time telling you what you already know, but suggest some ways of working, being with ourselves, being with each other, that can help us apply what we know from some leading edge things that are coming out in the field of psychology, psychotherapy, into how we show up in community applied polyvagal theory. That sounds like a big word, but it's always with us, our nervous system and staying regulated and being able to approach interpersonal dialogues from this regulated state to stay anchored in those challenging dialogues. So as most of you know, or as you're sitting here, just some basic definitions from Dr. Jeffrey Mao, esteemed Asian American psychology colleague, cognitive socialization categorizations, and that we really wanted to drill into how is power somewhat different than just prejudice and discrimination. That prejudice is judgment about groups based on categorizations, and usually these are negative, although they could be positive. Discrimination is negative behavior towards a group based on some in-group, out-group discrimination. And this becomes racism when it is discriminatory behavior backed by institutional power. And the power is very important to see and not see that when it moves along this continuum from prejudice, discrimination into some form of racism. So we could go back and forth intellectually and say, oh, biologically, there's not evidence for race. We have more genes in common than we have differences. That's true. And at the same time, we're sad to say racism is still here because of this being backed by discriminatory power and institutional power. And this is our work, which so many of you have been doing and continue to do for the long haul. So what happens psychologically when people have two different thoughts that are competing with each other of, I'm not a racist, and yet people say there's racism, that these two thoughts come together, or that I've been working in higher education for some years, as well as clinical practice in psychology, community, physical, mental health, integrative health. And I've often seen whether people are confronted with something that's different than their worldview, whether it's you've slipped into alcoholism and the spirit of alcoholism has control over you more than you have control over it, or the spirit of racism has visited you and it's controlling your thoughts and behaviors and actions, and you may not be aware of that. There's often a big pushback. Why? Because the ego defends itself to being kept from overwhelmed with denial. No, that's not happening. Defensiveness. Well, I'm not saying that that's happening, or minimization. It's not really as bad as you think it is. So I'm speaking to a well-informed audience. You may not have known these psychological terms, but I am sure you have encountered this. To stay in the compassion of the season for nonviolence, these defense mechanisms happen subconsciously. People don't try to be in denial or defensiveness or minimization. That happens to prevent your worldview and psychic structure to be flooded by what it didn't know. Years and years ago, psychology colleagues were doing groups to try to bring together the different communities in South Africa during apartheid. And I met someone who was in that group when I was invited to do some diversity group as an expressive arts therapist in Chicago. And this white gentleman who's very liberal, very open, said, I had no idea that Black people were unhappy under apartheid. And I thought, how in the world could you not know that? And I realized he truly didn't know that because of propaganda and the political structures that people are in. And I think we can see the same thing in different countries now, where people have been socialized a certain way and they don't know these deeper narratives and histories, which is so moving to me to see generational voices bring out. And when people find out, it can be very discombobulating, which is a cognitive dissonance, which is why working with a nervous system to stay anchored is very important. So these perceptions of power can be conscious, unconscious, subconscious, and I would suggest to you 80% of human behavior is operating at the subconscious, unconscious level. And this is what leads to the perpetuation of microaggressions, which I am sure every BIPOC person on the screen or in this room knows what those are. These unintentional little slights that dig at your racial, cultural identity, but they're just below awareness. You think, did that happen? Am I imagining this? Or, you shouldn't take that seriously. But our esteemed colleague, Dr. Derek Wong Su, City University of New York Psychology, has said, yes, it is happening. It is pervasive. And the cumulative effect of it is very detrimental for people's physiological, mental health, heart conditions, asthma, and so much more. So to pop back in time of why do we really need these applied polyvagal theory skills? Our nervous systems are there all the time. Even before we had this theory articulated to the way we do now, we're moving towards being regulated into a fight or flight or a freeze response. So as I mentioned, my family was in Memphis during Dr. King's assassination, and this is a balcony of the Lorraine Motel, which at that time was the only place Black citizens could stay in Memphis at that time where Dr. King was saying, and this was a balcony where he was talking with Dr. Jesse Jackson about what they're going to eat for dinner, and unfortunately got assassinated, and everyone is pointing at the assassin's bullet. So this was a tense day, as you can imagine. My father was trying to fly back from something, and it took him 3 hours to get from the Memphis airport to our Midtown home, which is normally only a 20-minute drive. The city was in a crisis. Um, as I mentioned, we're the first East Indian family. So my father, Indian psychologist, also my mother, an Indian psychologist, but particularly at that point with sexism and things, my father was asked with another white psychologist, we need you to try to do a race relation dialogue between Black leadership and the Memphis police. The city is about to explode. It could explode like Watts. So they thought about it and thought, let's take people out of the city. Let's go to this place called Paris Landing, which is kind of a forested park thing, maybe at 45 minutes from the city. So they're there. It's very tense. And we didn't know about nervous system theory then, but everybody's nervous system there. And the Black leadership looked at the white police in the room and said, we are leaving this meeting. And they left. And the other psychologist was so nervous. So like, God, I don't know what to do. I'm going to take a Valium and go to bed. So that was very super tense. It didn't go well because we didn't have these things that were going on then. But now we have an awareness of the nervous system. And here's a little view of this, that when we're in the regulated area, we're more in the green. And this is, even if people are doing microaggressions and throwing barbs at us, we want to try to stay in this open area. This is not just in your mind, but innervates every organ that you have in your body. When we get into that fight, flight, defensive reaction, or we feel it coming at us, we're in that sympathetic zone, which means you're fighting for your identity, you're fleeing. We see politicians playing on this and whipping up people into frenzies, into sympathetic nervous system activation overdrive, which they don't know how to downregulate. Or then you can go into dorsal vagal shutdown, where you're just sort of in a sort of closed down depressive state and you don't know what it is. Now, over time, through the miracle of the human body, you will naturally come up and down this ladder all the time, but there are skills and practices to help you be able to move through this more skillfully, through begin to notice through interoception what's happening inside of you, and then to become that anchor, even in the midst of the storm, to be in this green ventral vagal state in a dialogue, in that's what those psychologists back then with my dad and the other person probably would have benefited from doing, but they didn't know what to do. So they're trying to, not my father, but the other person took a Valium to get himself back because it's so stressed, didn't know what to do. And that you being that co-regulated presence, non-verbally, how you are, how you shows up can open the dialogue to a different level. So I realize in my 15 minutes, I can't teach all of applied polyvagal theory, but I wanted to offer you a book that was made by a very esteemed colleague, Deb Dana, who is a clinical social worker, was in Maine, but now she's teaching polyvagal theory all over the world. And she realized this needs to be not just in the mental health field, this needs to be for everyone. So this is a book she wrote called Anchored, which is to explain and give simple practices for polyvagal theory for the general public, which I would highly recommend, of seeing your nervous system as these roots and being able to keep yourself anchored and return back to that over time. And it is a skill that can be learned with practice. This is not just for therapists. This is not just for people who have graduate degrees. Everyone can learn how to do this. And this is part of creating sort of a social emotional coherent safety net in our community. So we want to be able to do that, to stay regulated through cognitive dissonance. That dissonance is what creates the other and the othering, which many of us have experienced. Andrea Waters King, the wife of Martin Luther King Jr. III, has said that the importance of inner work to eradicate what Dr. King, her father-in-law, referred to as the triple evils, poverty, violence, racism, that fuel systemic oppression, is very, very important. So that means this nervous system regulation, that means really looking and doing that deep shadow work of what I think is not me and realizing it is in me, and take those thoughts from being here to moving them further apart so I can look at them and show up with them in a different way with myself and other people. Another resource I wanted to offer you is Dr. Ruth King, Mindful of Race, Transforming Racism from the Inside Out, who grew up in South Central LA, as identified as African American woman, that when she came, and she was always fighting against the system, many deep chronic health issues, other kind of things, which we know happens with that heartbreaking interface between systemic racism and systemic health inequities, that this involves, when something happens, training yourself, training your first response, your nervous system to recognize what happened and admit this did happen. I did receive that insult. I just received this racial harassment, and then investigate how is it affecting me. And then before you respond, nurturing, how do I care for this distress? And maybe it's not doing anything. Maybe it's just withdrawing back. Maybe it's reaching out to my people and getting my own self together. But training yourself to do this rain, which is a good metaphor for us in the South Sound, because we do have a lot of rain. Now, we tried this in a year-long program with a retired faculty member, Aisha Harrison, and it was difficult. It was difficult being two women identified faculty of color with a lot of predominantly white students, but I think it gradually made a dent that we can begin to shift these kind of things over over time. And this book I really wanted to put on everyone's radar, which came out in November, which is by Justin Michael Williams and Shelley Tigleski. You may think, oh, Justin Michael Williams, he's a musician, but he's also an author. And this is How We Ended Racism, Realizing a New Possibility in One Generation. And it's really talking about having those big conversations, which what we're doing today is part of standing in the future where racism has ended, which is a different paradigm than fighting against something, but more fighting for something, and almost like universal backwards design, which we use in education, and what is the endpoint, and designing our curriculum forward to meet that endpoint, standing in the energy that racism has ended, and then our actions, our daily actions, move us towards that point, and calling people forward instead of calling people out. So this is really big work to do, and I highly recommend this book. It just came out in November, and maybe it might be something, that this group and others workshop on, because you can read it and work with it. And they've done some research studies that these procedures do work. They talk about many dialogue models, and one is this SUS model. And they say one of the biggest work of our time is to constructively talk across divides of power, having each side state what is your surface position and your posture and solution, but then to uncover beneath that. I also worked at the Dispute Resolution Center for some years. I've moved much more into integrative health, so I don't have time for everything. But beyond needs and interests, what are the highest intentions you have? What are those noble purposes? And then to synergize different parties' highest intentions, highest aspirations into this bigger luminous purpose, and then select decisions or solutions that best achieve this integrally luminous purpose. So the dialogue process itself is very transformational at our DNA level in our cells. When people go through this, their bodies look different when they come out, and also in our structures and systems. It's both and the micro to the macro together. So as we meet in our dialogue today, Williams and Tigleski invite us as a society, as individuals, and as a collective, we need to be willing and ready for our solutions to work. We must become the people who are ready to receive the world we're asking for. And they make the bold premise in this book that there are plenty of books and models that have solution structures of how that racism can end. Is we need to become the environment to heal at the root cause of where this can plant and grow and land. So to get us going into the dialogue, if you will, please just take a soft belly breath with me for the transition. If you're comfortable placing one hand on your heart and one hand on the abdomen. This is used in mind-body medicine skills groups around the world by Dr. James Gordon, post shootings, other kind of things. But to use it to access and come into coherence with our deepest wisdom. And as you hear these words, soft belly, soft belly, invite your breath to drop into your lower abdomen and feel the abdomen expanding, dropping you into that ventral vagal nervous system state where no matter what has happened to each of us individually, collectively, ancestrally, at this moment, in this moment, we become anchored. And we become that co-anchoring resonance for each other. As you deepen your breath, notice what happens to your heart rate. Is it faster, slower, or about the same? And notice any muscle tension. Is it more, less, or about the same? And as you scan your physiology, noticing, where do I have any imbalance, tension? And note that, allowing it to be as it is. And as best you can, shift your attention with the power of your mind to a place that's pain-free and stay there. Anchoring in the pain-free place. With kindness and curiosity, what's happening to your breath now? Faster, slower, or about the same? How is your heart rate? More, less, or about the same? And how is your muscle tension? More, less, or about the same? So as we deepen into this dialogue to create from the future that we are the anchors for in this moment, let's take a soft belly breath individually and collectively, whether we're on Zoom or in the room. And for soft belly breath for all those in our beautiful South Sound community. And another breath for our for our country. And for our beautiful world community. And the most important breath, let's take a breath at this moment for those people who would love to be able to take a soft breath, belly at this moment, belly breath at this moment, but may not be able to, whether they're in the body or out of the body. So with that, it's been such a deep honor to share some thoughts with you, and I look forward to being a member of the community in the dialogue. Thank you, Lynn and organizing group, for pulling this fabulous group together. May we have a deep dive into what's possible.